Closely related to this idea of there being a tax due to capital gains is something called an inflation tax. The capital gains aspect isn't the same as an inflation tax. That's a term you do hear. The capital gains thing I just described is related to taxes, but they're not the same creature. The inflation tax is actually a little bit more interesting, I think, to think about. To think about this cost of inflation or this kind of a downer about inflation, um, the easiest way to describe it is to go back to a real life example. We've all heard about the First World War. At the end of the First World War, the war came to an end with what was called the Treaty of Versailles. And in the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forced to pay what were called war reparations to the Allies who had won the war. So they had to pay back for the damage done from the war. And the what the government figured out along the way to do was to say basically, well, okay, you want pick a number. I don't know the number. It doesn't matter. You want a million marks. I think the currency wasn't called the mark at the time, but don't hold me to that. You want a million marks? We'll get you a million marks. There are ways. We'll have a million marks for you tomorrow. So they went over to the Mark printing machine, turned up the dial, and they said, here you go. Now, what that resulted in was hyperinflation because the goods and services in their economy weren't changed in that short period of time, but the amount of currency was. And so in my notes, I have a picture of a lady burning the currency because, by the way, when something like this happens, people want to get rid of it as quickly as possible. So once something ignites inflation, people with that money in their pockets will dump it everywhere they can, which raises its supply, which decreases its value even more and leads to a spiral. And so in my notes, I have this picture of this lady burning the currency between, it looks like in 1923 to 1924. She's burning it because the currency was easier to get and less expensive than firewood. They did all kinds of things with it. It was more valuable as blank paper than it was as printed currency because it had lost value so quickly. So why would people want to dump something out of their pockets when that happens? Because the buying power is eroding from within their pockets if they don't. That's why it's called an inflation tax. When a government pays its bills by printing money, it takes buying power from you and transfers it into that payment. And they don't even write you a tax bill to do it. They tax the buying power of what's in your pocket like that. It's a tax in the sense that it benefits the government at your expense. So it's a tax sort of in a figurative way. That's why it's easily confused with the capital gains tax, which is a real tax. This is a figurative tax. The government's made better because they can pay that bill. You're made worse because of the buying power of the currency in your pocket. But unlike a real tax or an official tax or a literal tax, this inflation tax figuratively takes the money from you and transfers it to them. They don't send you a bill, though. And the people it hurts the most are the people who have a lot of the currency. If you don't have much currency, it doesn't matter very much because, as we said, your wages are going to rise ultimately with prices. But it's the holders of currency that really get hammered with an inflation tax in that kind of situation where inflation is occurring due to the government printing too much money for the purpose of raising their standard or paying off some debt or something that they owe. That's what an inflation tax is. So it's a special kind of a cost of inflation. It's a unique kind. And I found that it's often confused with the capital gains tax because tax is in the title of both, but they are different creatures. So now I'm going to finish off talking about inflation as it really is in the United States. In my notes, I have copied and pasted from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS.gov, the most recent statement on inflation At this time, it was put out at 8:30 in the morning on October 13th. And the Consumer Price Index, that's our go-to measure of inflation, the CPI. It increased 0.2% in September on a seasonally adjusted basis. I mentioned with unemployment how we can adjust seasonally, after rising 0.4% in August, which means now that's on a monthly basis, these decimals. We don't really cite that very much. It's just, they measure it monthly, so they report it monthly. This is the one that when people talk about the inflation rate, this figure I'm about to cite, this is what our official estimate of the inflation rate is. Over the last 12 months, the all items index increased 1.4% before a seasonal adjustment. So inflation, just according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics right now in the United States, the way we measure it is about 1.4% annually. That's what we're chugging along at with our inflation rate. That is a historically low inflation rate, and it's been historically low now for quite some time. In my notes, I did the same thing as I do with unemployment, where since I'm updating this fairly often, I just keep parts of the old ones just to have them as a reference point. Back in 2005, it was for the first 8 months. I'm sorry, 2006. For the first 8 months, it was at 4.6. It had been 3.4 for all of 2005, according to this. Go back to 2010, or move up a little bit to 2010. Over the last 12 months, the all items index increased by 1.1. So we're chugging along right about where we were in 2010. 2011, it was 3.8. So it's picking up between 2010 and 2011. Now it's back down. Let's see, where's some other ones here? In 2012, we were at 2.9. We were at 1.1 in 2014. In 2019, we had moved to 1.7. So that's a convenient sample of these reports. That it's convenient because those are when I had posted them, and I just keep some of those first pieces of the paragraphs. But that gives you a feel. About the highest we've seen is probably that 4.6. I would say that's about the highest it's been since maybe it had peaked above that in the late 90s. But I think that was about as high as I can remember it being in my adult lifetime. So inflation has been pretty low, and that's the kind of, when you hear about inflation, that's the kind of thing that we're talking about. This is the kind of inflation rate that we have traditionally expected in recent history in the United States. And now you know that if we deviate very far from that, what that could mean. So I hope this was a little bit entertaining and enlightening.